Welcome to Exploration Session Summaries. Exploration sessions are offered online as opportunities to speak and listen to each other in a sincere effort to gain understanding about each other's perspectives on a World Conference resolution. This podcast includes all small groups summaries on one resolution.
In our life experiences, we discussed having to deal with in our mission centers the previous sale of church properties and how that has not gone over, especially in the Nauvoo and Kirtland area, but we're getting used to it. The other thing we talked about growing up and putting our monies into the building of the temple specifically, and that, so we're like part owners here, but also knowing that we've had tremendous experiences in both of those buildings. Mine personally have been, through the church, spiritual experiences, but I've also been there in secular ones. One of the things that we also discussed had to do with the difference between Robert's Rules of Order and common consent. They are very, very different. And if you don't know, check it out, folks. We also talked a little bit there about the fact that we weren't sure just how many of the rest of the world were actually going to ever be able to be in attendance at those buildings. When it came to the impact, we felt that this would be a major issue if the temple complex were to be sold or mortgaged or whatever. And we feel that there would have to be not just a world conference to discuss this, but probably several conferences around the world. We did note that we had learned about the lack of being able to discuss with the church because of the negotiations in the previous sales between LDS and our leadership. We did feel that the impact, if this were to happen, it would continue with the current feelings of lack of trust with the leadership because of the previous sale. And we also felt it would be a loss of identity for the church. But we did have the hope that even with discussing this, that the trust issue would be nullified. We really felt that for the world, the secular world, there would be no impact. For the world church, not as much as for the North American church. However, multiple ones of us knew of people from outside of the US and Canada who, once the temple was built, it was like on their bucket list to make sure that they got to Independence to attend conference with, activities in the temple as well as the auditorium. We also said let's be honest, the temple complex is our church's identity with the rest of the greater Independence, Kansas City community, but also within other parts of the world. When they see a picture of the temple, most people look at that building and go, wow, and say, where is that and what is it? I'd like to go there maybe. One last thing, we did feel there would be a potential for some people to leave the church if it were sold.
We were all devastated by the after the fact news of the Kirtland sale, and felt that this resolution absolutely needs to be implemented so that in the event of a sale needing to happen again, there's not that level of shock to the rest of the church body. We also think that there would be great negativity if this failed to pass, and that a split in the body of the church would be likely, and very likely the end of the church we know today. But on a positive note, we said when it passes, we believe that this would give the church body more peace of mind, and that the church body would feel more heard and not disregarded in their feelings towards the sale, if that should need to come down the road. We also said that as far as what new insights we all gained was how deeply we all felt in regards to the not really heard or talked about sale of the Kirkland Temple and surrounding areas, and that it was very devastating to a lot of us. But we think that if this were to pass, which we believe very strongly that it will be, regardless of the common consent, it would restore our respect for those leadership committees that our group felt had been diminishing over the course of the last few years.
We had a very good group. Some of the issues were very similar, if not identical, to the previous report. I liked one of our members' statement. This resolution was a knee-jerk reaction. Our history is in place. Selling buildings, no matter whether it's the historic sites already sold or the two under consideration, can't tie us down to fulfilling Christ's mission. We as members have elected our leaders who serve as a board, an executive board, to whom we've given authority to make decisions for the body. They can't take time to check with individual members. Just remember that not only is our history in place, church is not a building. We are the church. On the second question, few of us felt like we had any big life experiences to cause impact on us individually. We do think that the leaders should give the members some warning of what was under consideration. We need to have a conversation on whether sale is imminent or even being considered. Such conversations should help the presiding bishopric and the prophet, Council of 12, etc., take a better approach to handling the issue. Main thing I think that members want to do is be heard. On the third question, one of our members thought it was a rather limited question, since we as members tend to consider the community of Christ community, and the world, rather than the whole world, the community of Christ world. I had not thought of that personally until this was mentioned. For example, as has been stated, very few members of the World Church have seen the temple and auditorium. Take, for example, the Europeans, the Africans, South Americans, etc. So it has little impact on them. One example in contrast given, Notre Dame, when it had its big fire, the world heard about that, and we know that was undertaken to repair. So I think the thing that we concluded that we need to remember, in addition to what's already been said, is the church is not buildings. Our purpose is a peace church, and we are to be representatives of the Christ. Christ's mission is our mission.
On the first question, our group talked about the auditorium, mostly about how we as children remember it, mostly like running up and down the ramps and the services that were held there during World Conference. We felt that the auditorium and the temple are special, but the shared experiences that we've had with our family and friends there, it was more the gathering experience and not the building itself. Now, if the amendment passes, we felt that a positive effect would be that it relieved the concerns of many people who would like to see it pass, but a negative concern would be that it would hamper the negotiations for those that were in charge of the sale. We felt that we should put trust in our leadership. We approved them and elected them to that position that they're in, but also felt that the membership wants to be a part of the sale. to be involved with any sales that should come up in the future. No matter how it goes, the resolution, pass or fail, it's going to have an emotional impact on members. Now, if it's passed, there's going to be some relief, and it's going to diminish the mistrust that some have in our leaders. With technology coming on, it may turn out that we no longer have to use the auditorium for world conferences, that we could have these sites throughout the world where we could have like Zoom meetings. And if that occurs, I know we have a couple each conference, but if that occurs more on a worldwide basis, the importance of the auditorium may be diminished in our own sites. That we feel that maybe there's a possibility that this resolution could be amended to exclude the auditorium, that it could be sold in the future, only have the temple involved. We also realize that throughout the church, there's some strong opinions on in favor and against this amendment.
In our group, two of us were actually lived. I was born and raised in Ohio, and another one lived in Ohio. So we had very close contact with Kirtland Temple. In fact, I've worshiped many times in Kirtland Temple. I have participated in worship services in the temple, and facilitated activities in the temple. So that was kind of a different bent for me when it came up for sale. I visited Nauvoo only twice, so it wasn't quite as close to my heart as Kirtland. One lady had equated it with, in her case, in 2023, she had been pastor, and her congregation, after 43 years, had to come to the decision to sell their building. And in the discernment process, they went through a lot of pain and a lot of decisions to be made, but decided that that building, in the end, their hope would be it would be a blessing to someone else, as it had been a blessing to them and their group and the community for the past 43 years. We would hope that the same would be continue for Nauvoo and for Kirtland as we continue to navigate this. We did agree that communication is important, and that while the bishopric felt that they were on the rooftops preaching it somewhere, and as having been a pastor, you send out emails, you send out text, you talk about it in church, and yet there are still people say, I don't remember hearing that. And so there's always that breakdown in communication. The impact of the resolution, could it impact our World Church from making a timely decision in the future? We don't know. With prior knowledge and the discernment process, that congregation was able to make a decision, but that is something that takes time, and something that, yes, if we had that kind of time, it would be wonderful to have. The other question that was brought up was, would this rescind World Church 866? And are we going backwards in some of our decision making? If this is passed, will this reaffirm our common consent that people want to participate in decisions? That was something we thought we needed to look at. This brought up almost more questions for us than it did answers. If it didn't pass, would there be a sense of distrust and secrecy, or would there be a sense of relief on some people's part? We recognized, and some of us had probably more contact than others, the depth of feelings of those who had made those decisions, and the pain and the anger for those of us that had the initial pain and anger, but we still have those questions. Will we be going forward or will we be going backward? What will it mean for our decision-making process? Will it bring healing and a level of trust back to the people if it passes? And finally, one of the things that was commented on was that in the end, we need to decide as a faith movement who we follow and what we believe. We have always said that we follow the teachings of Christ. We didn't follow buildings, and we believe in the worth of persons and making them better. Sometimes the hard decisions are made so that the worth of persons, that people can be helped. We may not see that here in the US, but it happens in other places. And sometimes we just have to take the medicine with the good stuff.
So we started off, I think, saying that we all had in our church, our personal church history, visits to historical sites. Those were important parts of our becoming part of what we thought was a bigger faith movement, whether it was with family or with youth groups. And for those of us in our group who weren't connected to the central location of the church very much, these kind of cross-country sojourns were an important part of our connecting to the church. There are a lot of people who don't have that connection. Historical sites that I would think of as being important are not to them. The concern that was legitimate and that we validated among lots of members with respect to the most recent sale of historical sites might have been thought of as more of a North American centric concern than a concern of people who are members throughout the world, and these places, these facilities don't have nearly the connection with their faith that they might for people that kind of were indoctrinated in the North American church. The concept of bringing something like this to a conference might be problematic in a couple of ways. One, the very bringing of the topic, we maybe underlying thought, don't trust the leadership of the church to make a decision. Therefore, we as a body feel we need to make that decision. That in and of itself could be a healing process of discussion. It could also, however, be a very divisive discussion. So just the topic itself. But if the topic were to be approved, then the bringing of the issue before a world conference is problematic for maybe a few reasons. One, we're on this triennial schedule now. A decision either needs to be anticipated 3 years in advance, or a decision is made that properties need to be sold, the temple or the auditorium, or mortgaged, which is what it says. And then we have to wait 3 years to get to a world conference approval. That may put the finances of the church in an untenable position. What's the underlying motivation of this proposal? It seems to indicate a potential broken trust. We think that perhaps bringing this then up might be beneficial, if for no other reason than it might encourage the church leadership to think more about transparency and more about communication. And perhaps that's what's driving some of this. If this is approved, where does it stop? What is the next thing that the World Conference wants to have a decision about? And, I could come up with a whole laundry list of things. Where apostles are assigned, what happens to other church jurisdictions? Are they created? Are they dismembered? Once the World Conference starts to say, we want control over church organizational decisions or finances, other than at the very top line of a budget, where does it end? And it might be a slippery slope. Nobody wants to have to do, we think, the sale of properties that are important to people's heritage. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that the church membership isn't willing to provide the financial support to the church needed to do both the things it needs to do from a personnel standpoint for mission and take care of the church's properties. We thought that the impact in our world and our community, candidly, would be of no import. There might be an impact in a local congregation for me. I happen to live close to the center place where there are maybe more issues about this. And what I think of as my hometown congregation, I don't think there's much impact. And certainly outside of the community of Christ Church, other than listening to our Mormon brothers and sisters talk to us about what we're doing with our properties in the world, whether or not our church continues to own buildings that it owns, we think is of little to no significance.
Background wise, we talked about, so I mean, I personally worked at historic sites and such. We had some others that had volunteered, and others were just, devastated by the decisions. Others believed that we were moving forward and saw kind of that vision with that. So we were kind of all over the map and kind of our backgrounds and kind of our feelings going into this discussion tonight. Impact wise, we think it's good to have ownership in the decision with the common consent process, but yeah, also seeing some of those pratfalls that were already mentioned before by James in terms of, the 3-year span and how do we set up a decision that was going to be like, how are we preparing for this and, timeliness of it happening. We do agree that especially the auditorium needs some new vision with this moving forward and the use of it. So we think really a lot of our discussion was just it's positive to have a discussion of how these buildings that we have now or we're talking about in this resolution, missionally move us forward. And we know there's some activities out of the temple and out of the auditorium that are missional, and as in addition to the offices and things that are there, and ability to gather there. But also needing to really have a discussion over the auditorium, especially with the vision of where that building is going moving forward with that. So kind of our insights for tonight was in our group was a lot of discussion of what's the new possibilities with this and getting people talking about the new possibilities that could come out of the temple and the auditorium and these buildings not being just buildings, but tools for mission. We did talk a lot kind of as we got rolling. There is a lack of connection to, we talked about the historical sites, but also even these buildings outside of the Kansas City, Independence area, especially for younger adults, kids. I live in that circle kind of outside of the Kansas City, inside the Kansas City area. So we are familiar with it. People that I talk to outside of the church realm are familiar with the auditorium and the temple. But once you get outside of this kind of local geographical area, outside of the church, there's not much connection to it at all. And inside the church, some of the younger generations even have very little connection to the actual physical buildings with that, as well as we had some discussion on what's the worldwide connection and how we use these buildings moving forward. So having that discussion is good. One of the questions that did come up in that discussion is what are the costs of the auditorium and the temple operations now and moving forward? How much is this when we're having this discussion in terms of not just the missional use, but the financial use? What are those costs moving forward? And something else insight wise that we really discussed was what's the future of World Conference? If one of the main uses of the auditorium is for World Conference, what does that look like as we look at connecting, not physically, but being able to even connect in like remotely and having remote sites and such? What is the future of World Conference and the use of the auditorium and the temple complex moving forward?
We saw 3 different issues in this resolution that they were kind of pointing out. And the one is the idea of sacred space and common consent and being essential to the enduring mission of the church. And so, like others have said, that there are connections that a lot of us have with these sacred spaces, but the discussion is really good for us to have as far as what is sacred space? Is it just a building or is it a building and more? So it's good for us to decide what our definition of sacred space is. And what part of this seems to touch on is a trust issue. Some people have been blindsided by this. And so it seemed like this resolution was a way for people to have peace of mind and feel like they wouldn't get blindsided again. Some people didn't know that there was a non-disclosure statement with the sale of the building. And so that was part of the reason why a lot of people didn't know about it ahead of time. So if this resolution were to be adopted, for some, it might mean peace of mind that this couldn't happen again in the future. But if the church ever got to the point where the sale of these two buildings would be considered, the church must really be in dire straits financially. And that was something that hopefully we would know about before it got to that point. Some were kind of surprised that this came from Canada and not from the United States. And so we were kind of thinking that maybe there were people that saw these as being more important in the world community than what we had thought, because we always just thought it was a local thing, but maybe it is more of a focal point for members around the world. And we also mentioned that these two buildings are actually important to Independence area. They're used locally for other activities besides just what our church uses them for. Oh, and that some of our local churches have had to sell their buildings. And there is life beyond the sale of a building, that some congregations have continued to have very vibrant ministries in their own communities. And so maybe how we view mission and even the identity of the church going forward is something for us to think about.
Well, we talked about how helpful it is sometimes for groups to make a decision because everybody feels to be a part of it, but it takes a lot of time. And especially in sale of property, we don't always have that time. We see the places that were sold as history through all our experiences, but they are not our mission and they're not who we are as a church. Our history began in 1860. These buildings take a lot of work to maintain. We talked about that a lot. Money and time and effort. Probably a very small percentage of the church has ever actually done work on them. How will the church local community be affected? If it's passed, it would give security that it won't be sold without our consent. And how do the auditorium and temple affect other congregations other than North America? We wondered also, as was said, how it's seen in other parts of the world with our brothers and sisters. Many have not been aware of the cost of upkeep, but we feel attached and want to have a voice. This would help those that are hurting from the other sale, probably bring some unity.
A lot of what we've heard, a lot of our members, touched on that, some of those issues as well. As far as the experiences that flavored our perceptions, one of the members' family actually had left England during the early days of the church and moved to the United States in order to come to the gathering. So they have a long time history with the properties as they came along. One of our members actually had been a pastor at Kirtland. So, and most of us had part of the online meeting explaining how it all came about. So we either had or knew that there was a lot of shock and disappointment and maybe even feeling of insult the way the previous historic buildings sales went through. So we feel like that flavored a lot of why this resolution is here. And as some have said as well, yes, to us it also speaks of distrust of those who are in positions of leadership in our church. One of our members, by the way, is actually from Canada, and he is in favor of the resolution. One of the members is in an area of New Mexico that joins with Texas, and you've all talked about how church buildings have had to be sold and mission centers have had to combine. So we know that the church is of dwindling membership. And it could happen that there could be a financial problem in the future that might necessitate the consideration of the sale of some of these other properties. We hope it doesn't come to that. Echoing again, if it comes to that, yes, the church is in pretty dire straits. It looks like the impact of the resolution, we're thinking, could open up more options, maybe having more people aware of the situation. But the downside of that too is if it passes, that would mean we as members would be taking on more responsibility to be informed and to participate instead of just leaving it all to the bishopric. That too brings up another point, that if this is passed, the bishopric might feel like they're having their hands tied, and that there may be some hard feelings, feeling like they're not trusted to act in the best interests of the church. The church is more than a building. You know, it's the people, it's the mission. But these buildings are integral to our gatherings. And yes, they are missional. So it does make sense that it would give peace of mind, possibly, if it felt like everyone's input is being respected and considered. We hope that it never comes to the point that either of these buildings would have to be sold. We're hoping too that discussion at conference about this resolution does not devolve into people wanting to make sure everyone knows how angry, upset, insulted, disappointed they were with the previous historic site sale. That we consider this resolution for what it is and reason together and decide what we feel is best.